Now I know the length of this video might seem intimidating, especially for those who primarily have just arrived upon the doorstep of the galaxy-spanning lore-verse we know as 40k, or Warhammer 40,000. It's likely you've come here off the back of Space Marine 2 and are now hungry or just curious for those important next steps. Well, I wanted to give a singular video which covers everything from the current situation within the contemporary lore to the foundational elements of the verse and the broader hobby, so that by the end of this video you will not just be slightly more interested in 40k, but have a solid informed foundation to build upon. And yes, I've made beginners videos in the past, but the most recent one was 5 years ago. It's time for an update, and it's time to improve upon what I'd done before. With that said, despite its length, the level of detail in this video is very much for anybody new. But as I always say, even if you've been in the hobby and verse of 40k for decades, a back to basics refresher can be both cozy and grounding. One of the most important things to emphasize right from the start is that there is no correct way to approach 40k, and do not listen to anyone who tells you otherwise, because this in itself is a large part of the fun of 40k. It's entirely up to you what path you choose. Do you continue deeper with what you already know, or tentatively try out unexplored parts of the verse? Perhaps, if you feel confident enough, just dive in with a new, totally alien area of the lore. What I hope to achieve in this video is to clarify and answer common questions I regularly see and hear from those coming brand new into the 40k space, across the 3 key areas of the hobby: lore, tabletop, and painting. I've also felt that some of my previous guides, as I said, didn't give some essential details in terms of the foundational lore, so I attempt to address that in this video, and that's why the runtime is longer. But of course, you can never cover everything sufficiently in a single video, so I've linked many of my other videos below for additional reference for you to follow up with, and of course always the recommendations at the end of the video. The world of Warhammer 40,000 is so immersive and addictive a setting that it's why so many of us have been committed to it since childhood. In that time, the game and lore have expanded many times over since those halcyon days of swapping Space Marine models in the playground and saving up a few coins to buy one new blister pack of Astartes. In the modern world of 40k, there is an overwhelming amount of lore and miniature expansion happening monthly and yearly. Many would say it's a better time than ever to get involved, yet there are some hidden obstacles you may want to consider before choosing specifically where to begin. Suffice to say though, if Space Marine 2 piqued your interest, it is a great time to go further, and the best advice I can give you out the gate is follow whatever interests you. If you're curious about the Tyranids, go down that path. If you want to know more about Chaos, explore this, and so on. There's certainly advice that can be given to try and ensure you don't waste time and money in an area that could become a dead end, but ultimately it's very subjective. If something seems intriguing to you, then it's probably a good sign to just trust your gut instinct and walk a little further along that path, which is all important to carry you across the first stepping stones. What I'm saying is maybe don't go deep on every single faction, raking through all of the lore about them before choosing where to start, unless of course you're choosing to start with the lore. So intro over, let's talk about the 40k space and where you may want to begin with it, starting with a broad introduction of the verse itself. Warhammer 40,000 was first introduced by Games Workshop in 1987 as a tabletop miniature wargame set in a grim dark future, primarily seen through the lens of humanity. That is to say, the Imperium of mankind. This is a reality where various factions battle for supreme dominance across the entire galaxy. 40k is characterized by endless war, be that skirmishing at a city turf level through to planetary conquests and system-wide campaigns fought both in space and with significant planetary deployments that consume millions, if not billions, of lives. The Imperium of mankind, humanity, stands as the galaxy's most dominant empire. It faces constant existential threats from a host of enemies, alien species which are collectively known as Xenos, the dark forces of chaos who ever attack the mortal galaxy from the parallel plane of existence known as the Warp, and those traitors who dwell within. At the core of human civilization and the Imperium in this time is the Emperor. He is said to be human, but his true origins, or even what he is, remains something that continues to be the subject of fierce debate and speculation. See my series linked on screen about the Emperor, or find it on the channel here. So the Emperor is what is known in the lore as a perpetual, that is to say, an immortal. He is also one of the most powerful psychic beings to have ever existed, and is capable of feats most humans would only believe a being with godlike traits to display. He once walked among humanity. He reunited them in the aftermath of their galactic civilization collapse and spearheaded a new Imperium of mankind that saw the Space Marines as the vanguard force to enable his new empire. However, all did not go to plan, or maybe it did, and the Space Marine legions descended into a brief but brutal civil war known as the Horus Heresy. This, in many ways, would define the Imperium as it would stand for the coming 10,000 years. The Emperor barely survived the battle. He was all but dead, and has since been enshrined upon the Golden Throne for some 10,000 years. Now this remains his ongoing life support system, and it must be fueled by the endless sacrifice of thousands of humans who exhibit psychic power. This is but one of many moral and ethical contradictions which define the Imperium, and it makes for fascinating subjects and material in the galaxy to explore. Such dystopian expectations for humanity, though, are typical of 40k, because this is a truly bleak and harrowing narrative verse. Hive cities, which can support tens, even hundreds of billions of souls, are another defining characteristic of the Imperium. Most civilians upon these worlds will never see the sky. Their lives are spent in endless labour and industrial toil, grinding against the tithe expectations of terror itself. 40k has long defined human reality within the galaxy of the Imperium as being one that is far more pessimistic and bleak than most other deep lore universes, especially when it comes to the lives and worth of humanity, so much so that it regularly crosses over into what you could describe as space horror. Many of its novels introed with the famous line that, "To be a man in such times is to be one amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable." Its tabletop rulebook signed off the introduction with, "The universe is a big place, and whatever happens, you will not be missed." It's hammering home the point that in the scale of the galactic Imperium, human lives mean very little, which is very dark when set against, again, many other verses which tend to have at least some sliver of hope and enlightenment. None of that for the Imperium. Most who are enlisted to the military will leave their homes never to return. Entire planets are extinguished, with few ever having known that they existed at all. And as regular viewers will know, some of my favourite examples of what life in the Imperium is like are entire planets descending into barbaric anarchy because somewhere on the other side of the galaxy, an overworked, exhausted scribe in the administratum of the Imperium made a filing error, or they put a 1 where they should have put a 0. Consequently, that world was not sent its vital shipment of water or other critical resources, and anarchy ensued. There's also the favourite thought experiment with 40k that an anonymous human drone working in a seemingly infinite hall of scribes discovers a communication from a distant human world. They have discovered a technology of miraculous possibilities. It could change everything. But time is short. It is a world suffering various threats. Imperial reinforcements are needed urgently, not dissimilarly to the events you might have seen unfold in Space Marine 2. The scribe stands ready to escalate the request urgently, but then, they see the form has a box checked incorrectly, and so into the fire the paper goes. The planet never receives its supporting aid and is later scoured by nightmarish aliens. This is the bleak, dark comedy of the 40k galaxy. It's very much a tone that permeates throughout. Squads of elite human soldiers achieving an almost impossible objective. The Inquisition hears of this just in time to arrive and discovers that, oh no, they've come into contact with chaos. There's only one solution: the unit is purged from orbit. The galaxy of the Imperium is brutal and often ridiculous. I've compiled a list of a few videos that I think make for interesting follow-up viewing, as I said, so check out my pinned comment or click below this video to see the links, or at the end of the video. Now, one additional note when it comes to foundational concepts in the 40k verse, it would be too detailed to really dive into in a heavy way the subject of psychic power, but it also is essential to mention. Because in the galaxy of M41, many factions contain what are known as psykers. These are essentially individuals who can wield what you may otherwise call psychic or magic power. They display, for example, some level of foresight. They can communicate across space telepathically. Some factions have strong psykers, others, like the Tau, none, and some, like the Orcs, have something of their own going on. Generally speaking, psykers connect their mind to that parallel dimension I mentioned before, known as the warp or the immaterium. This, though, is extraordinarily dangerous, and so who can use these powers do so at considerable risk. The warp is an unstable and dangerous realm filled with ethereal horrors and demons that continually seek to break into our real material space. For every psyker who engages with the warp is potentially opening a gateway for the entities within. Because of this, psykers are strictly managed and monitored within the Imperium. Those who go as so-called unsanctioned psykers will either be detected, tracked down and executed, or they will be collected for delivery to the Emperor's Golden Throne, where he will consume their psychic power and basically their life energy. Now, psykers are something that are well worth understanding in more detail, for they are another of the very fundamental features of the 40k verse, but they often fall into the background of narratives, when they are in fact this foundational element of the stakes at play in the galaxy of M41. So, although Warhammer 40,000 features many alien races, it remains primarily focused around humanity and the Imperium, and this is the lens by which most things are shown to us, which means there is often an element of narrative bias, and it is worth being aware of that many things are told from the perspective of the Imperium, and so you might need to think slightly adjacent to that and consider, are they being truthful, or is this just the Imperium's view? In terms of the Imperium itself, one of the most fundamental concepts to understand is that human civilization now sits in the vast shadow of a technological zenith that is so far beyond its current capabilities, there is little, if any, hope they will ever be able to return to this. Humanity as it was during its earliest technological expansion, many thousands of years before the Emperor would emerge, had begun to tentatively reach out into the galaxy from Earth and found new colonies in space. Over millennia, it was able to continually grow stronger and stronger until human civilization had achieved an unimaginable level of technology and culture. This was known as humanity's Golden Age. In the Age of the Imperium, this is now referred to as the Dark Age of technology, and it is referenced as such because that same Zenith technology was so world-ending in its capabilities that when a devastating galactic civil war was sparked, it is believed by artificial human constructs known as the Men of Iron that the level of technology combined with multiple events after saw human civilization crushed into near total collapse. Humanity was left broken, fragmented, and hanging on by a thread. Many worlds across the galaxy completely turned in upon themselves in devastating complete civil wars that were a full apocalypse and left them all but dead worlds in time. Others tried to isolate themselves and maintain some semblance of order and able to survive. The many worlds of humanity at this time had varying success in their survival. Earth, or Terra, descended into total anarchy and became a world of feudal barbarism and bizarre techno-barbarians where the zenith level of technology meshed into the apocalyptic collapse that had begun. In the aftermath of the devastation, the upshot of these events were the rise upon Mars of a cult of tech worshippers known as the Mechanicum, the Cult of the Machine. These would become in time the Mechanicus. They are the technology experts of the Imperium. Now, it was because of this period, the Dark Age of technology, that cemented humanity's great fear of AI. Obviously, we would call it artificial intelligence. In 40k, they call it abominable intelligence. And this is why in the Imperium, all AI is strictly outlawed. This is why you will often see them using humans in place of artificial constructs. They use these cybernetically adapted servitors and servo skulls, for example, and that contributes to the bleak horror aesthetic of the Imperium and 40k, but it also has a solid grounding in the lore as to why that is necessary. Now, I will repeat myself a little here from earlier, but out of this period of total civilization collapse emerged the figure who was initially nameless. He was just another warlord upon Terra, but soon he became known as a terrifying and unstoppable force, with an army that none could stand against. These were the first terrifying iteration of the Space Marines, the Thunder Warriors. Now, this period became known as the Unification War of Terra, the early beginnings of what would become the Imperium, and this effort was led by that anonymous figure soon to be known by all as the Emperor of Man. What happened to the Thunder Warriors, you might ask? Move along, citizen, best stick to your work. Asking far too many questions here, but I do cover this in my Emperor series of videos. So, after unifying Terra and making a pact with the Mechanicum of Mars to use their vast stockpile of starships and titanic war machinery, but whilst still allowing them some autonomy that the Emperor would rarely allow others, he would launch with his new army of now Space Marines, the Great Crusade. Its purpose was to reunite all the lost worlds of humanity, and this also saw the most brutal campaign of Xenos extermination and human subjugation as they swept through the galaxy. The new Imperium taught worlds to throw off fear and superstition, to embrace a new Imperium founded on secular rationalism. The only issue was, you had to comply or you would be brutally beaten into submission. The Crusade was ultimately an unmitigated success, or at least it was until the devastating civil war, known as the Horus Heresy, would befall the Emperor's nascent Imperium. This came before the Emperor could complete his larger goals for humanity, and as I said before, much that occurred in this time really defined the Imperium for the coming 10,000 years, which were, for the most part, a period of immense stagnation and civilization decay. Because without the Emperor, humanity and the Imperium didn't really know what to do with itself. He had started the course for humanity, but nobody ever really knew what he was doing, what his longer-term goals were, and so when the Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne, humanity was left asking, so now what? In the aftermath of the heresy, which shattered the unity that had been established, what followed was a slow, painful recovery, and it saw the Imperium struggle to even maintain what had already been achieved in such a brief time during the Crusade. By the contemporary period in M41, the Imperium was already effectively suffocating under its own choking bureaucracy. However, events in the contemporary time have been still both devastating but also progressive. The Imperium has begun making the smallest steps toward advancement, but it still exists as this bizarre juxtaposition of ancient tech that is beyond the comprehension of many of its tech priests, traders, and citizens, an all-powerful yet also precarious civilization, and one which across thousands of years of conflict with alien races who are more often than not excessively hostile, they have become highly xenophobic. The Imperium and all humanity views other alien races as needing to be exterminated, so in the contemporary time of M41, the days of secular rationalism as espoused by the Emperor are completely gone. The galaxy-spanning empire of humanity is now a bleak totalitarian state that worships the Emperor of Man with furious zealotry. The Imperium exerts extreme and total control over its territory, systems, planets, and citizens. This includes many aspects of their lives, including economy, public, private, and social life, education, whatever qualifies as science, and a near total indoctrination to its ideology and religion. Any who are not seen to be a follower of the teachings and the laws of the Imperium and the Emperor are playing an extremely dangerous game. While they may evade authorities for some time, years, decades, maybe even enough to cause some kind of uprising, time and time again in Imperial history, it has been demonstrated that any pushback against the power and authority of the all-consuming Imperium leads to tragedy. Because even if a group managed to overpower the authorities of a hive city, of a planet, of a system, ultimately they will face the unrestrained power of the Imperium of mankind, to which most of those who could even begin such an uprising truly have no comprehension of what they will face. The Astra Militarum, the Space Marines, the Adepta Sororitas, not to mention the Inquisition. All of these sub-factions within the Imperium are something very rarely seen by ordinary citizens. Most often they will just see local law enforcement, governors, politicians on their own worlds, and so on. And this is so true that it is likely why in the earlier stages of an uprising, it may seem to an ordinary citizenry something that could work. Why do they have to follow the rules and the regulations? Why do they have to suffer? Why do they follow all of these orders given to us by this Imperium that exists out there somewhere in space that we've never heard of, never seen a representative from? Why do we follow the rules? Well, unfortunately, they will find out very often why all too late. But this is the strange issue of the Imperium and why sometimes these uprisings would occur, because most ordinary humans cannot truly comprehend the scale of the Imperium or the kind of forces that can bring to bear. Most ordinary humans will never see a Space Marine. They are near mythical figures who are only spoken of in Imperial scripture or by generations previous who may have seen one during a conflict on another world even. It's believable that most citizens will not even believe that Space Marines actually exist. They might consider them something more like an analogy or a reference to an ancient time that no longer exists. Of course, any who do push back against the Imperium will either be executed outright or publicly displayed as heretics. For in a civilization consumed by the zealous worship of the Emperor, as the Imperium is in M41, the term heretic or traitor is often largely quite open to interpretation and is well known to have led to large-scale abuses of power and execution. So the Imperium uses this combination of deeply entrenched worship and imperial ideology to control and mobilize mass populations of its citizenry for its armies like the Imperial Guard and the Imperial Fleet. It also will utilize its citizens to fulfill whatever role is needed, no matter how dangerous or unpleasant, especially when advanced machines are outlawed, and the rule of law upon most worlds is often severe and absolute. Not to mention the fact that a steady supply of disposable penal workers are desirable in a society where human labour is the primary driving force. Step out of line and you'll probably find yourself consigned to a mining duty forever. So entering into the world of 40k can cause a bit of narrative whiplash, because on the one hand, you see that as powerful as humanity is, you see the Space Marines, the starships like you see in Space Marine 2, yet this stands in stark contrast to the reality for most humans. And even with the Imperium's small progression in the most recent times, it still stands on the edge of annihilation by various alien races or entities, not something that you would know from playing Space Marine 2. It struggles to maintain order within its own civilization. It's a bleak reality devoid of hope or advancement for the vast majority of human souls. Somehow, though, humanity has survived to this point despite standing at the edge of complete destruction and extinction, a highly ignorant, fearful people who exist in a constant state of decay, and where critical information to fundamental technology is just often simply lost, or destroyed or stolen. So yes, Space Marines are glorious, amazing, honourable, the face of the Imperium. But they're not the dark reality for most humans who struggle to survive in one of the most, as we say, brutal and bloody regimes imaginable. Such is the state of decay that alongside basic survival, one of the Imperium and the Mechanicus' primary goals are to locate any lost technology from the Zenith period, the Dark Age of technology. These are most often in the format of what is known as an STC, something that I will not be explaining now, as again I have an existing video you can check out, and it would add at least an extra 90 minutes to this video were I to start on that topic. But basically, an STC is a blueprint for human technology. It's a means by which to safeguard and standardize any technology from a knife through to an advanced war machine. And despite being the galaxy's largest territorial power, the Imperium is continually besieged by external alien enemies like the primitive and savage Orc, the highly advanced Eldar, and the bug plague of the galaxy, the Tyranids. Yet one of the key things to understand, and that I often reference in other videos, is that despite the alien enemies that threaten the Imperium being very visible, they are in fact not the greatest threat to the stability of the Imperium. The greatest threat to humanity is itself. To the surprise of no one, humanity is the same as it ever was. Ego-driven, crazed power struggles continually threaten to destabilize worlds. Planetary uprisings from worker revolts to cults corrupted by the dark powers from the warp all contribute to the never-ending threats that can bring down a planet of hundreds of billions of human souls, but start out from only a single individual. Outside of this, the Imperium is rife with power struggles between its own factions, of course to a less disruptive and direct extent among those of a high loyalty military perspective, such as the Astartes, the Space Marines, the Imperial Guard, the Sororitas. You don't see too much issue there. But for those with greater power, such as the Inquisition, the Administratum, the Mechanicus, they continually create through their broader activities situations which can disrupt anything from local hive cities to entire systems, sometimes even coming into direct conflict with one another. Such encounters tend to be minimized and ignored unless they risk becoming a scale that one would consider anything approaching a regional civil war. So beyond the alien or the Xenos threats, one of the most malevolent and ever-present threats in the galaxy is known simply as chaos. This collective term refers to an extremely dark and insidious power that is difficult to explain in brief, unfortunately. But it's to do with that parallel realm to our mortal reality known as the warp, which itself also remains quite difficult to define. But what we know is this is a hellish space that corrupts and twists those who succumb to its influence. Within this realm exist the so-called dark gods of chaos, destructive entities who fight not only against those in mortal reality, but are in fact directly empowered by the activities of mortals. They fight to dominate material space and to destroy one another. Their existence is one of eternal, unending conflict. This is known as the Great Game. And within the warp itself, undefinable forces twist their reality. They warp literally any who succumb to their influence, and this can turn ordinary mortals into horrific nightmarish forms who then exist only to serve the gods and further their goals. The most hated among them are the Chaos Space Marines. They are traitors to humanity, the Imperium, and the Emperor, and who, in the aftermath of the civil war known as the Heresy that nearly destroyed the Imperium 10,000 years ago, they fled to relative safety within that hellish realm known as the Warp. Suffice to say, every faction in Warhammer 40,000 has its own deep history, ideological agenda, if they're capable of such a thing beyond just killing on sight, and combat style. But the most iconic and legendary figures of 40k are of course the Space Marines. They are officially known as Astartes, and the Space Marines are genetically engineered super soldiers. They're barely classifiable as human, but all begin as humans. They're the most heavy-hitting infantry within the Imperium of Mankind, clad in advanced power armor. They're effectively human walking tanks, and one of the reasons they appear in such bright armored colors is because they can take all but the heaviest firepower thrown at them, and so they don't need any camouflage. They rely in fact on their visibility as a form of intimidation to their enemy. They're founded on the heaviest principles of brotherhood that have continued since the Emperor created them at the reunification of humanity in its Great Crusade. Each group of Space Marines is known as a chapter, and they have their own outlook, detailed history, achievements, and granular traits that define them. By stark contrast to the Space Marines, the bulk military force of humanity, known as the Imperial Guard or Astra Militarum, would see where Space Marines could deploy a squad or two to deal with a problem on a world, the Imperial Guard would deploy hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of soldiers and hardware. Most planets also have a heavy standing presence to defend the infrastructure and key installations throughout Imperial territory. The Militarum represents the ordinary human soldiers of the Imperium, bolstered by advanced heavy tanks, artillery, and air support. Yet the Imperial Guard, to say that they are the ordinary soldiers, they're not cannon fodder. They're often jokingly suggested to be. They are, in fact, some of the most highly trained humans, second only to the Astartes. Their discipline is second to none, and they are sent into hellish war zones that few could even begin to imagine exist. Many planets throughout the galaxy have delivered such exceptional contributions to the Imperial Guard that their entire world's singular purpose is to found new regiments and deliver them to wherever they are required. Worlds such as Kadashan, Mordian, Krieg, Vostrolia, Talon, Valhalla, and of course, the tragedy of Cadia. Another very notable force of the Imperium are the Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle. They emerged much later than the Space Marines from a period of time known as the Age of Apostasy. This is in M36. The current period is M41, so 5,000 years previous to the contemporary time. Now, this was a very fractious time for the Imperium, and the Sisters of Battle emerged in its wake as a new and permanent force for the Imperium, or at least for the Ecclesiarchy, which is the religious body in the Imperium. The origin of the Sororitas is a little deep in 40k lore for beginners, but essentially as the Emperor was viewed as a divine figure, a state religion emerged. So, after thousands of years, this then led to a struggle and eventually a reformation of imperial religion. The religious body, as I said, of the Imperium, known as the Ecclesiarchy, was thereafter forbidden to raise men at arms. Hence, the Sororitas are all female, plus they're the only military faction who answer primarily to the religious authority of the Imperium, the Ecclesiarchy. So this also makes them terrifyingly zealous individuals, and they tend to solve their problems with chainswords and flame. I remember quite recently in one of the Dawn of Fire books where the sisters are interrogating an ordinary human who they've discovered is potentially had some corruption by chaos, and somebody sees what's going on behind the door, and the sisters are like, don't worry about what's happening in there, and just close the door. We'll dig deeper into some of the Xenos enemies of humanity later in this video, but as to the depth of the lore and setting that is Warhammer 40,000, it has grown far beyond the tabletop game. It encompasses a wide range of media, including novels, comics, and video games, each exploring the complex lore in greater detail and providing deeper insight into the various factions and characters. But now, let's talk about the current state of play in the contemporary Imperium. The contemporary period of M41 remains for the Imperium of Mankind very challenging, but also, for the first time in 10,000 years, it has a glimmer of hope. In this age, the Imperium has entered an era of unparalleled darkness with the arrival of the Cicatrix Maledictum. This is a massive warp rift that has split the galaxy in two, severing communication and travel between two vast regions of the galaxy. This catastrophic event, which occurred in the aftermath of the fall of Cadia, a key imperial world which had until this point in time been one of the bastions which oversaw the only entryway to the warp, the Eye of Terror. In the aftermath of its destruction, it has thrown the Imperium into a truly unprecedented scale of disruption. Simultaneously, we saw one of the most positive developments for the Imperium in this era, the return of an Astartes Primarch, Roboute Guilliman. Over the 10,000 years since the Emperor was placed upon the Golden Throne, the Imperium was ruled by a human council known as the High Lords of Terror. These figures would obviously periodically die and be replaced over many centuries and thousands of years, but the intrinsically necessary nature of such a position was always cemented into the Imperium. Nonetheless, the political aspects of it remained strained and led to the severe degradation and stagnation of human civilization, not to mention many events which saw humanity once again reach the very cusp of another fully apocalyptic collapse. Now though, with the return of Guilliman, the Imperium finally sees a figure re-emerge from that mythical age of the Crusade and Heresy, because Primarchs are demigod-like in their abilities, and as one of the Emperor's sons, his authority is without question. Finally, the bickering bureaucracy and stagnation could finally come to an end, at least once the most pressing issues such as the Rift and the many incursions by Xenos and Chaos are addressed. Guilliman is the leader of the Ultramarines chapter of Astartes, formerly a legion during the Age of the Heresy. They are in size the same as all other Space Marine chapters, but as one who originated from the very beginning of the Space Marine project, just like the Imperial Fists, the White Scars and so on, they're referred to as a first founding chapter. The Primarchs, the artificially created Sons of the Emperor, were the foundational template for each of the Space Marine legions. Functionally immortal, the Primarchs are, as I said, often described as being demigod-like in their abilities. They all also share some specific trait or characteristic of the Emperor himself. They are, in a way, all shards of the Emperor. Few loyalist Primarchs would remain though in the aftermath of the Heresy, not simply because they were killed, some just disappeared, but none remained present throughout the past 10,000 years to aid the Imperium and guide it. Of those who were known to exist, they disappeared, like I say, on quests of their own or just into the mists of the warp. The traitor Primarchs were twisted beyond all recognition by the darkness of chaos, and most, if they still exist, have chosen to live within the warp upon so-called demon worlds, supported and surrounded by their traitor Astartes legions. But the return of Guilliman also saw the arrival of the Primaris Space Marines. These were the culmination of a project spanning many thousands of years, developed by the Archmagos of the Mechanicus, Belisarius Cawl. Cawl is an enigmatic and strange figure who is often very old in his thinking, which is ironically very forward-thinking. He pushes the boundaries of imperial authority and Mechanicus doctrine, and maintains an essential yet very strained relationship with Roboute Guilliman. While the new Astartes would join their brothers who had served the Emperor and Imperium for 10,000 years, a process was developed to advance and augment the so-called Firstborn Marines, for the Primaris were larger, stronger, and more durable than their predecessors. And so this is what we see Titus go through in the conversion process to becoming a Primaris in Space Marine 2. The Primaris project had been pivotal in turning the tide against the enemies of mankind. They saved the Imperium in the wake of the Great Rift's emergence under the leadership of Guilliman, and now they offer a new hope in every battle across the galaxy. The threats to the Imperium, though, remain substantial. Chaos pushes back on all sides with various power struggles occurring in their own ranks. Abaddon, the Despoiler, first captain of the arch-traitor of the Heresy, Horus Lupercal, has become one of the more formidable enemies of humanity. He caused the fall of Cadia, and some speculate he was even the architect of the events that caused the Great Rift to occur. Alongside the horrors of chaos are of course the innumerable Xenos threats, principal among them the Tyranids, and while these alien nightmares have been known to the Imperium for millennia, Their most aggressive campaigns have come in the contemporary time. Their numbers are incalculable, their hunger unending. They seek seemingly nothing more than the complete and total consumption of all biological matter in the galaxy, and it has become difficult to see what may be capable of preventing this from occurring. Despite these overwhelming challenges, the Imperium has achieved notable victories. The Indomitus Crusade, led by Guilliman, represents one of the largest military campaigns in the Imperium's history. It saw the successful vanquishing of Chaos forces and a glimmer of hope for humanity. Guilliman himself now stands as Lord Commander of the Imperium, rallying the galaxy's forces against the ever-growing threats. Within the Imperium, there are many others though, who have returned and gained legendary reputations, such as Saint Celestine, the living saint of the Sororitas, resurrected by supposedly the Emperor to continue the eternal fight against Chaos. Her presence on the battlefield has reinvigorated many regiments' morale and inspired countless soldiers. More recently, the Primarch of the Dark Angels, Lionel Johnson, has also returned to the fray quite unexpectedly. Just what this may mean for the Imperium is as yet unknown, and we still wait for the meeting that must occur between Guilliman and the Lion. Yet even as the Great Rift continues to destabilize the galaxy, ancient enemies like the Eldari and the Necron re-emerge with a new vigor. Their war has continued for millions of years, and both seek to reclaim their lost dominions. Additionally, the Imperium's political conflicts are just as dangerous and threaten to weaken its foundations. For those within the Imperium who belong to the department known as the Inquisition, they stand with unchecked power. Its mission is to theoretically safeguard the Imperium from traitors, aliens, and heresy, but it has also unleashed thousands of years of paranoia, fear, and authoritarian horror, ever tightening its grip on the populace. In this contemporary age of darkness, the fate of humanity continues as ever to hang by a thread. The return of legendary figures offers a glimmer of hope, but the galaxy remains a brutal and unforgiving place. Most significantly of all though, psychers all throughout the galaxy have en masse reported visions, whispers, and dreams, which seem to suggest that something stirs within the Emperor himself. He who has sat atop the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, presumed a corpse and all but dead, yet still present. It is unknown just what the Emperor even is at this point in time, or what would occur should he return to the mortal realm in some physical form, were that even possible. Some suggest he will be reborn in the eternal realm of the warp. Yet it is in fact the presence of the chaotic rift that divides the galaxy, which seemingly has begun to stir the power of the Emperor, pouring the raw energy of the warp into material space. Humanity has reported a growing number of psychers emerging from the populations, more than would be ordinary. And the religious faith, devotion, and fanaticism of humanity has grown almost exponentially in the wake of the threats that it now faces, all of these also believed to empower the Emperor. All of this combined leads to some challenging questions, foremost among them, if the Emperor were to return to humanity, what form would he take, and what would it mean for the Imperium as it stands in the contemporary period of M41? Meanwhile, in the eyes of Roboute Guilliman, the pure, straightforward survival of humanity is the key concern. Because humanity has become so violently and debatably ignorantly xenophobic in the far future, it has almost no qualms about committing planetary levels of genocide. If you are not human and don't worship the Emperor, then you're basically an enemy, a heretic, and must be exterminated. Diplomacy is almost not a thing for the Imperium, and the usual recourse is to just shoot on sight. But in fairness, there was a time when humanity had attempted to engage in a more diplomatic approach, but this over time disintegrated through most of its contact with aliens, leading to some kind of conflict. So now it simply believes that all other life must be extinguished, or at the very least dominated and enslaved for either work or experimentation. These cases though are rare. There are 6 other races that are seen as the enemies of humanity. and any of these factions can be played by you within the tabletop game of 40k or models collected and painted. Some players will dedicate themselves entirely to a single faction, building it up, fleshing it out to the limit of their model making ability, while others may have multiple armies of many different factions, like myself. Firstly, the Necrons. They are one of the most ancient and technologically advanced factions in the 40k verse. They predate most others by hundreds of millions of years. Their origins lie with the Necron tier. They were a once frail and short-lived humanoid species who were early to emerge in the galaxy, but not the first. And unfortunately, their civilization grew very slowly and painfully as their planet suffered under the harsh conditions due to their proximity to the nearest star. Radiation heavily damaged the early Necron tier at a genetic level. Their lives were all too brief and painful, and this fostered in them a very strange sense of mortality. Their entire culture was focused around death and the preparation for it, but it also instilled within them a deep resentment of the reality of their own existence. Enter then the Old Ones, a much more ancient and powerful race of godlike beings who were said to be long-lived and masters of advanced technology and psychic power. The Old Ones had lives that were so long they were functionally immortal, and from what we know, they seeded life in the galaxy. They reached out to the Old Ones to save them with their secrets of life, but were denied. The story of this time, because of its ancient history, is very difficult to know with accuracy, but it is believed that an immense war took place, which saw the Necron defeated. Yet, they remained desperate for power and immortality, and this would see the Necron tier make their infamous pact with beings they had discovered known as the Catan, godlike star-eating entities who offered them a solution, eternal life through the transfer of their consciousness into mechanical bodies. But this gift was also a curse. The Necron tier were stripped of their souls and their free will, thus they became the Necron, emotionless, undying machines bound to the will of the Catan. The once proud Necron tier civilization was now enslaved to these cosmic entities, and they waged a cataclysmic war against the Old Ones, known as the War in Heaven. It's even believed that the Catan had some grievance against the Old Ones, but this is little more than speculation. After this war devastated the galaxy, the Old Ones were largely eradicated. The Necrons eventually turned on the Catan, shattering these gods into shards to prevent their further control. With the galaxy still in ruins though, and the Necron facing the creations of the Old Ones, the Eldari, bearing down on them, they went into hibernation in vast tomb worlds, waiting for the time to rise again and reclaim the galaxy, to wait out for all mortal races to become extinct through entropy. In the current timeline of Warhammer 40,000, the Necrons are slowly awakening from their slumber. Led by their immortal dynastic lords, they seek to rebuild their once great empire and reassert dominance over the galaxy. Because of their ancient origins, their technology is far superior to that of most other races. They feature weapons like the Gorse Flare, which disintegrates matter at a molecular level. But despite their formidable power, the Necrons are not without their flaws. Many, especially the lower ranks, have completely lost their individuality, functioning as little more than mindless automatons, whereas the Necron ruling nobles known as overlords and cryptex retain vestiges of their former personalities and ambitions. They often scheme against one another in a quest for whatever resembles political supremacy in such a bizarre culture. One of the most unique traits of the Necron, though, is their mastery over time and space. Some Necron constructs, for example, like the Tesseract Vault, can manipulate reality itself, and they have perfected teleportation and stasis technology. This allows them to phase in and out of battle, even supposedly freeze enemies in time. Some cryptex are even able to predict and manipulate time. Collectively then, the Necron have a very cold view of other races in the galaxy, whom they largely consider to be entirely inferior, fleeting creatures that are just unworthy of the stars. Some Necron lords, such as the Silent King, who once led the Necron into their mechanical bodies in the process of biotransference, have begun to realize that other races, particularly humanity, could be useful allies in their fight against the growing threat of the warp and the forces of chaos, which they seem to view as the more pressing threat. And this opens up a whole can of speculation which is too big to discuss today, but there are implications that at one point in time the Necron did have other allies, and that the warp itself is their true nemesis. The Eldar, or the Eldari, are one of the oldest and most advanced races in the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy. They have a history also stretching back hundreds of millions of years like the Necron, for at their peak the Eldar ruled the galaxy, with unparalleled mastery of technology, psychic power and art. However, this vast empire was brought into complete and absolute ruin by their own hubris and decadence, culminating in a catastrophic event simply known as the Fall, which changed the course of their civilization forever. This was triggered by the Eldar's slow and extreme descent into hedonism, as their once noble culture became corrupted by unchecked indulgence in pleasure, excess, and the extremes of sensation. All the horrors that they had unleashed manifested and coalesced in the warp, to the point at which a new god was born. A psychic scream so powerful it tore through the galaxy, annihilating most of the Eldar population throughout the galaxy, consuming their souls. This event also created the Eye of Terror that I mentioned earlier, a massive warp rift which remained a gateway between real space and the warp. Very few Eldar survived, and they were scattered across the galaxy, their entire civilization shattered and brought to its very knees. The fear of Slaanesh to them remains deeply ingrained in their culture, for they know that upon death, their souls will be devoured by the Chaos God unless they take specific measures to prevent this. Those preventative measures are the Soul Stones, which you see decorating Eldar armor. They trap and collect their souls upon death, allowing them to be placed into the protective confines of the Infinity Circuit aboard their planetary-scale ships known as craft worlds. There are multiple interesting sub-factions of Eldar. The most well-known are the Craft World Eldar. They live aboard these self-sufficient starships, which are the remnants of their once great empire. And these were built prior to the Fall, as some Eldar basically saw what was coming down the line, but none could truly imagine what would be unleashed. Each craft world is home to a distinct Eldar society governed by discipline and a cultural system known as the Path. This is designed so that individuals will dedicate themselves to specific roles such as warriors, artisans. The purpose of this is to protect them from the temptations of excess that once destroyed their civilization. It also enables them to better control their emotions. All Eldar, but Craftworld Eldar specifically, are known to excel in psychic ability. They use them both in warfare and everyday life. Chief among these are the Farseers. They are powerful psychic leaders who guide the craft worlds through visions of the future. Their technology, such as grav tanks and wraithbone constructs, is also forged from a strange psychoplastic material that the Eldar create. This is one of the unique traits of the Eldar, and something which they learned very early on in their culture, that they could actually take the raw energy of the warp and fashion it into a physical material, and that is what all of their societal culture, their constructs, their ships, their weaponry is built out of. But in extreme contrast to them stand the Drakari, the Dark Eldar. They are those who had fully embraced the excesses which led to the Fall, and in some respects it's a miracle that they survived. They live in the sprawling labyrinthine city of Komorra. This is hidden deep within the Webway. What's the Webway? The Webway is the means by which the Eldar travel through the galaxy. It's basically a transport system which sits between material space and the warp. It's believed to have been constructed by the Old Ones. The Drakari have abandoned fully their psychic powers because they fear using them would draw the attention of Slaanesh. Instead, they sustain themselves by feeding on the suffering and the pain of others, prolonging their lives through acts of sadism and cruelty. Thus, Drukhari are raiders and slavers. They will regularly leave the webway to launch raids on other species and capture them to drag back to Camorra, where they will be tortured and tormented to both rejuvenate Drukhari bodies and souls. Their society is built on ambition, suffering, artistry, and egotistical power struggles as they vie for power in the dark, treacherous hierarchy. But unlike the disciplined Craftworld Eldar, the Drukhari revel in their cruelty, seeing it as a necessary means of survival in the shadow of Slaanesh, and something which fundamentally defines their culture. A more recent and important faction to emerge within Eldar culture are the Inari. They represent a new movement within Eldari society, led by Ivrain, the emissary of Enead. What is this? It is the nascent Eldar god of the dead, for the Inari believe that the key to defeating the chaos god Slaanesh lies in harnessing the power of death itself. Enead is a god formed from the souls of the Eldar ancestors within their Craftworld's infinity circuits, and it has been prophesied to one day rise and challenge Slaanesh itself, and thereby restore the Eldar to their once galactic position of dominance, and to make the Eldar immortal once again to where they can be reborn again and again from the warp. What the Inari are seeking to do is hasten Enead's awakening, because unlike the Craftworld or the Drukhari Eldar, the Inari advocate for cooperation between any and all Eldar factions, which is extremely unusual, because they believe this is their only chance for survival. Inari warriors then believe in this cause so much they will fight alongside those of any other faction. Their unique connection to death allows them to draw power from fallen comrades, which gives them an edge in battle as each death fuels their strength. But their philosophy and growing influence also represents a significant shift in Eldar society, as many more Eldar are drawn to the promise of liberation from Slaanesh's eternal hunger and the tedious stagnation which has been the staple of Eldar society for the longest time. Because despite their advanced technology, psychic prowess and martial skill, the Eldar have been for the longest time a dying race. Their numbers are very few. They're constantly under threat from not only the forces of chaos, particularly Slaanesh, but also the many other races of the galaxy, the Imperium, Orcs, Tyranids, and so on. This decline has defined so much of what constitutes Eldar society that they cling to this fading glory while trying to stave off their total extinction. But this relationship with Slaanesh is the most pressing existential threat. They cannot survive while Slaanesh exists, because they know that without careful precaution, their souls are destined for eternal torment in the warp. And this danger shapes their culture, it drives their relentless pursuit of survival. But it is only now, with the radical hope of the Inari, they see a way forward. They are sometimes seen to aid others, such as the Imperium. There are members of the Eldar who have discussed and collaborated with Rabute Gilliman in recent times to try and chart a path forward in the shadow of the Great Rift. But it is always believed that the Eldar have their own priorities above all others, and many should be cautious in working with them, for who knows what they see down the line through the abilities of their Farseers. Chaos are a faction of many faces and contradicting goals. Its name is fundamentally self-explanatory, for all the forces of chaos originate from the parallel dimension known as the warp. This is a reactive plane of existence which absorbs the most powerful emotions, desires, and dreams of mortal creatures. This immaterium would be the realm which led to the birth of the so-called Chaos Gods. They manifested over millions of years, and each focuses on specific mortal desires. Khorne is the god of blood, representing war, rage, and hatred. Tzeentch is the changer, representing ambition, scheming, conspiracy, and sorcery. Nurgle, the plague god, represents mortality, morbidity, and despair. Slaanesh, the god of lust, greed, excess, pleasure, pain, and perfection. The continuing desires and emotions of the galaxy's inhabitants sustains these entities, and it's something which ties humanity very closely to the Chaos Gods. However, they will also reach out into the mortal realm through manifested entities made from the warp energy itself. These are known as demons. and these hellish creatures are enough to send any ordinary humans insane on sight. But they're also backed by the traitors to the Imperium, the corrupted Chaos Space Marines. The gods of chaos and their agents can also inflict upon the minds of mortals cults, worshippers that spring up on planets across the Imperium, an insidious form of corruption. And this is again one reason why the Imperium of Mankind is so ruthless and total about purging heretics. Because while chaos itself in the material world appears as one enemy which simply wages war, it is in fact in an eternal conflict with itself, which sees each of the chaos gods fight for domination over the others. And this is what occupies the majority of their focus and their energy. Each god's ultimate goal is complete domination of the Immaterium, a goal which seems entirely unattainable and dangerous to their own existence were that even to come to pass. The most pervasive aspect of it is corruption, because this can begin as the tiniest seed in an individual mortal and spread to consume an entire hive world, a system of planets. There is no limit to how far it can spread. And the forces of chaos constantly and eternally seek to overcome and dominate the Imperium of Man and other factions. The traitor Chaos Space Marines seek vengeance for the defeat in the heresy. It is one of the most central and existential threats in the 40k verse to the Imperium of Mankind and humanity, for it embodies the darker aspects of the human psyche, the raw, destructive power of the warp, and in many ways it reflects and shows humanity what it dare not look at, the darkness inside every human. The Orcs in Warhammer 40,000 are one of the more cheerful races. They're brutal, warlike aliens who live for battle, destruction, and just having a good smash up. They're one of the most numerous species in the galaxy, thriving in conflict and spreading just general violence wherever they go to. They're driven by a pretty simple philosophy: might makes right. They believe that fighting is the greatest enjoyment in life. They view warfare not just as a necessity, but as a form of entertainment. Orcs are believed to be most likely a genetically designed species, again, of the old ones, like the Eldar. They're designed for extreme hyper-violence and made to be almost impossible to permanently exterminate, and this may be one of the reasons why they were developed by the old ones to fight against the Necron, because they just send waves and waves of orcs against them to basically just clog up and consume them. But unlike the bleakness of the Imperium, the Tyranids and so forth, the Orcs are very sunny, they're hilarious, they're dangerous, and their entire society focuses around casual violence at basically every single opportunity. The Orcs' genetic disposition sets them to see things as generally good and enjoyable, especially when it comes to fighting, which means they have an almost unbreakable morale. They never really see failure as a negative, because failure just means you get to have another go later. They also operate more on instinct by design than learned knowledge. They trust what they are feeling they should do more than making decisions. In saying that though, as their willpower becomes more powerful and as more orcs are present, collected together en masse, they can literally will things to be true by collective belief. This is the very strange feature of the Orcs, which sees them have sort of psychic power, but also not really. One example would be the Orcs' belief that painting their vehicles red makes them go faster. It's not a real thing, but because so many Orcs believe it, it just happens to make it true. They also have a strange ability to just smash together vehicles' weapons from scrap, and then they just seem to be quite effective. How any of this works is anybody's guess, but it's believed to be due to their latent psychic ability, where when they get together collectively, their belief in something actually affects reality, as their technology often works just because they believe that it should, regardless of its actual functionality, something that often heavily confuses those such as the Mechanicus of the Imperium. But this trait is also extraordinarily dangerous, because effectively it means if an orc can think of it and convince enough other orcs that it should be a thing, they could make almost anything happen. In terms of their society, they have no real governing structure. Their leadership is chosen by progressively being better at smashing their rivals' heads in than the other, until eventually an orc reaches the position of being a war boss. And when orcs collect in huge numbers, They may then launch a massive campaign of raiding and attacking anything that's not orc by launching a war, essentially a huge, no-holds-barred slaughterfest. Anything that's in the way, best dig in or just get the hell out. Orcs are constantly fighting among themselves as much as they are against other factions, because they have no grand plan beyond just enjoying endless conflict, which in some ways mitigates the dangerousness of them to the Imperium, but at the same time this actually revs them up and can make them more dangerous, so it's kind of a double-edged sword. Their society is anarchic and they thrive in chaos, not chaos but chaos. So while an individual orc may not be as advanced or intelligent as other races, through their sheer numbers, their unbreakable toughness, their passion for war, they become one of the most dangerous and unpredictable forces in the galaxy, and many who have underestimated them have not survived to tell the tale. And then of course, as everybody knows, a good favourite of mine, the Tau. The Tau are a relatively young and highly advanced alien race in the 40k verse. They're known for their collective philosophy known as the greater good, and this emphasises unity, cooperation, and the betterment of all species under Tau rule. Unlike most factions then in the galaxy, the Tau prioritise diplomacy and technological innovation, which is almost unheard of anywhere else. They can be extremely formidable in combat, where they see it as being necessary, but this varies by degrees and dependent on who they're facing. Their rapid development is largely due to the intervention of mysterious, highly intelligent beings called the Ethereals, who appeared during a period of intense civil war between the primitive Tau tribes. This was also a massive misstep on behalf of the Imperium, who originally saw these tribes as being no threat and something which could be dealt with later. Then the Tau were cut off from Imperial space, and when eventually they emerged, the Ethereals had united the warring factions under this concept of the greater good, and their society had transformed from isolated tribalism into a highly structured, technologically advanced empire, which saw them master advanced technologies, including anti-grav systems, battlesuits, and energy weapons. This ability, though, to progress technologically at such a pace is unmatched in the galaxy, and it is a terrifying prospect to the Imperium. The Tau Empire itself is divided into so-called septs, each with its own distinct culture and function within their society. Their military is highly organised and relies on advanced tech, such as, like you said, battlesuits, drones, highly effective long-range weaponry. But unlike other factions which use brute force or psychic power, the Tau rely very heavily on their strategies and ranged warfare. But they also ally with some they have encountered, because one of the key tenets of Tau society is to promote cooperation. They seek to expand their empire, often offering other races the chance to join them for the greater good. However, those who refuse may well be met with military force. Nonetheless, they incorporate other species into their society, the polar opposite then of the Imperium. So within Tau society exist also the Kroot and the Vespid, both who serve very specialised roles within their armies to, again, terrifying effect. So they stand out in the 40k verse for their optimistic vision, which contrasts very much with the dark bleakness of many others. And while the Tau may prefer diplomacy and peaceful expansion, they found themselves in numerous conflicts with others who are more terrifyingly capable than they might realise. The Imperium of Man, for example, views the Tau as dangerous, heretical upstarts, and the conflict between them is frequent and extreme. But it's when they have encountered other Xenos that the most brutal and shocking battles have occurred with the Tau, the Orcs, the Tyrannids, and of course, Chaos, to which they have an extremely confusing relationship. Because the Tau possess very little understanding of the warp and its dangers, they lack psychic abilities, which makes them quite resistant to the corrupting influence of Chaos. But it also leaves them vulnerable to the ignorance about the many threats posed by these forces, which they are entirely unprepared to face, with, as you can imagine, quite horrific consequences. And then there are the Tyrannids. These are an unusual exception to all previous Xenos, because they do not operate at an ideological level, they do not have a political structure or even a single leader. The Tyranids are driven by a relentless hunger and the biological perfection of their species. They take the form of a vast swarm of predatory creatures which consume entire planets. They strip them of biomass, which fuels their continual evolution and progression. They travel through space en masse in hive fleets. Their goal is simple: consume everything in their path. And they operate as this single collective synaptic network which is known as the hive mind. This controls hundreds of billions of creatures, from the smallest gaunt to the most massive biotitan. Their armies are made up of highly specialized, genetically engineered creatures that fulfill different roles, ranging from fast-moving clawed gaunts to heavy support creatures like the Carnifex. Each Tyranid organism is bioengineered to fulfill a highly specialized role, but they're capable also of adaptation to meet the needs of an invasion through so-called rapid evolution. The Tyranids are very unique in 40k for their total absence of individuality, culture, or emotion. They are a pure biological force of nature, unclouded by ethics, morality, or even personal drives. They're only driven solely by the imperative to consume and evolve. In contemporary 40k, the Tyranids remain an ever-present threat in the galaxy, perhaps more so than ever. Several major hive fleets such as Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan have already invaded the galaxy, wiping out entire star systems, and they continue to pose an existential threat to all. The Imperium of Mankind has made desperate efforts to stop the Tyranid invasions to very minimal effect. They've employed drastic measures to slow their advance. One of the most notable figures in these efforts is the infamous Inquisitor Cryptman, who made controversial decisions during the Tyranid incursions. But in fairness, he was one of the very first Inquisitors to attempt to stop the Tyranids. Unfortunately, when faced with unstoppable hive fleets, he ordered the Exterminatus, that is, the total destruction of planets, including all citizens upon them, to simply deny the Tyranids biomass, effectively starving them. He tried to create a firebreak of planets by just destroying them en masse. This tactic bought some time, but it also led to the sacrifice of billions of Imperial citizens and their worlds. Cryptman would also later lure Hive Fleet Leviathan into Orc territory, hoping that the two forces would weaken each other through a prolonged engaged warfare, which did work to a degree, but these actions earned him condemnation from his peers, leading to his excommunication from the Inquisition, because it soon became clear that whilst the Orcs and the Tyranids fighting each other was not a terrible idea on the face of it, eventually one of them was probably going to win, and when that happened, the victor would emerge 10 times, 100 times more powerful than when they had gone into it. As the Tyranids continue to arrive in the galaxy in ever-increasing numbers, the Imperium and other factions are struggling to contain the threat. And in truth, many of the highest commanders within the Imperium are facing the grim reality that the Tyranids may eventually overwhelm the galaxy through sheer weight of numbers and evolutionary superiority, something that they continue to make every effort and plan to prevent from happening. But the Tyranids are one of the most horrific enemies facing humanity. They're seemingly unstoppable and have already wrought untold destruction upon the galaxy. Worse still is the theory that their already devastating campaigns are in fact only the initial scouting parties to the galaxy. Because if this is true, it seems almost inevitable that the Tyranids could be the ones to end everything. So that hopefully is a prime introduction to the lore of 40k. You have the background, the contemporary and factional details. So now the only question is, which path will you choose? Because within the 40k hobby, there are three core paths in no particular order. You've got the lore and the narrative, the miniatures and the painting, and then of course the tabletop game. Now I don't think it was as true in the past, but I think these days it's obvious we should probably also include video games as well. So I guess 4 key paths. But I think the only reason I don't really consider video games, and I won't be listing these today, and while of course there is replayability, I think this video today is primarily for those looking to come in to the other areas of the hobby. because the three I listed tend to be the sort of thing people not just dabble in, but become fully committed to over many years. Now, before I get into each area, I will make a couple of suggestions. First is that if you're not sure what you think about any specific area to come into for 40k, do your research. If you're curious for the lore, as I said, you've got YouTube, but also try out some audiobooks. They're a bit easier going than a novel, and they're quite affordable. I was sponsored for a good period by Audible here on the channel, and I still use it because it's good value and it's very user-friendly. I recommend checking out a couple of titles like Belisarius Call's Great Work, the Dark Imperium trilogy, the Eisenhorn trilogy, and for the Sororitas, try The Triumph of St. Catherine. And last, I should throw in Horus Rising. It's an essential starting point, but I mention it last because the Heresy series is not to be taken lightly. It's not the default starting point, especially when you're looking at the whole series being some 60 plus novels strong. However, if you're feeling a more general yet still strong interest in wanting to go harder into 40k, probably the best way to do that is to pick up a box set, a starter painting set, and most importantly a core rulebook. Not included though in the box set. They do like a soft version, but the hardback core rulebook really has a lot more. Now, to be fair, that's going to set you back a few hundred clams, so use your own judgment on this one. But as I've tested a few times on my community section for the channel, and as I've seen with other people's channels as well, there are plenty of hobbies that require a pretty similar outlay, so really take your pick. Now, the Games Workshop store also has a Start Here section, but comically doesn't have the core rulebook in there for some reason. Why is the core rulebook so essential? Well, it's because it not only contains the game rules, but also a solid summary of the lore, a showcase of what 40k is, and a flavour of what you will find in other supplements and general 40k material. It's the best starter compendium around, and at around £40 or $60, that's pretty good value. Now, in regards to the other details related to each area, there are both pros and cons, but let's move on. Now, starting with the lore as the primary vehicle for entering more broadly into 40k might seem strange or perhaps obvious to some. And I will mention that I do have a video which covers a few options for how to get into 40k lore, books, audiobooks, and that's linked below also. But essentially, my rationale for at least looking into the lore of 40k a little more deeply is that it will help you to inspire and inform other decisions should you wish to then go further and explore the dangerously addictive hobby of miniatures and tabletop gaming. When it comes to 40k lore, there are of course many ways in which you can explore it. There's YouTube right here, obviously, and that's a great place to start if I do say so myself, but I do highly recommend checking out the audiobooks, the novels, yes, even tabletop books, and I'll explain why tabletop books shortly. Now, although I threw a few suggestions out there, the core question people always still ask is, where do I begin? And it's a fair question, and usually along with that they say, do I need to read and learn 40k in some kind of chronological order? The answer to both is, it doesn't really matter. A lot of what makes 40k interesting is the mystery, the concepts of how the world, its characters, and its conflicts function. This is something that, at a very early stage, is just pretty confusing, and it's quite often overwhelming. I've found that the best advice is to try not to focus in too hard early on. Don't try to understand every definition, every detail, every terminology. Just try and find something that looks appealing and see how you go. And then when you approach the next piece, that will make a little more sense, and the next one a little more sense, and so on. It's kind of like getting into a show that has many characters and factions. Initially you have to get through the first 3-5 episodes, but then suddenly you'll be flying. 40k feels like that. It's very confusing to begin with, but once you get going, it all starts to connect the dots together, it makes more sense, and then it becomes addictingly interesting very quickly. So really don't overthink where to start. Another big piece of advice from me is, and I emphasize this is advice because I know it's important to some people, try to let go of worrying about spoilers. 40k by its nature reveals things to you in a very chaotic fashion. You will get references to things coming at you all over the place, and eventually you need to just let go of worrying about learning that some detail about a thing or a person or an event that you so far had no knowledge of is just going to come in. It's the nature of the beast, and you will enjoy 40k all the more by just letting the material wash over you. Just go with it and enjoy the full picture slowly coming ever more into focus. I always joke that the biggest spoiler of all is the Heresy series, because you know right from the very beginning that the Emperor ends up on the Golden Throne, but nonetheless it still takes 60 odd books to get there. So I think really when it comes to the lore, the advice is pretty simple and straight to the point really. Try and find an angle that interests you, go with that. There's a lot more that I could dive in and rake over, of course, but it's not really necessary. When it comes to the lore, there's just tons and tons of it, there's decades worth. And it's, to be sure, not all S-tier literature, but by and large I find you quickly start to get a feel for what is going to work for you and what is not, and then let that inform your future decisions. Well, I think the key one that I would choose here is availability. Whilst there are many audiobooks these days, a good chunk of the lore is contained within those, as I said earlier, tabletop rulebooks, so-called codexes. They detail the rules for each faction you will play as your army in 40k, but there are also supplementary books which come out from time to time. These detail unfolding events in the contemporary verse, or they will delve into additional areas such as the hive world of Necromunda, say. There are also adjacent novel areas such as 40k crime. They focus on a specific hive world, and it's generally stories that are more human-centric. Why then is this a con? For me, it's not, because I personally just consume all of this stuff as soon as I can. But if you were coming into things new, it's not good, because it means the lore is just scattered across this vast area. And if you're not already into the 40k verse with absolute commitment, you might not wanting to be just casually shelling out for a factional codex or campaign supplement book that you're only going to really be reading the value of 30% of that book. So you might be thinking, well, surely they would just document very key events elsewhere as well, right? They wouldn't just put it in a supplement book for the tabletop game and then just never put it anywhere else. You know, surely they would make some kind of omnibus or a single campaign overview which summarizes it. Nope. And also, most supplement books for 40k are one and done. You get it the month it comes out, or never again, which honestly is the case for most physical novels as well. Secondary print runs for 40k novels are rare, other than maybe the Heresy series and a few key books. So actually, scarcity is one of the biggest cons when it comes to getting into the lore side of 40k. Now, on Games Workshop's site, Black Library, you can find a good amount of material in ebook format, but when it comes to campaign supplements, they may be in their subscription service, Warhammer Plus, locked in their vault of digital media, but maybe not. Also, if you're wanting to get hold of any truly rare and older 40k material like the Imperial Armor, the Heresy Black Books, or just novels which had more limited runs, brace yourself, because the reselling market for such things is aggressive. One example is, for me, I recently got a good deal on a simple Warhammer Crime paperback that I missed at release. I can't recall the reason why I missed it, because I usually just get them straight away, but it was extremely rare to then see that book afterward, and I'd only ever seen it on eBay for a few times, and usually well over £100, which is ridiculous. Thankfully, recently I got an extremely good deal, and I can now check that one off the list. So the lore of 40k can become all-consuming, but the hunt for physical material is never ending. So this is a bit of a negative if you're coming into the lore of 40k, and really the hunt for building your own collection can become pretty all-consuming, especially if you're leaning in on that hunt for the physical material. It truly can be never ending. However, I wouldn't allow this to really diminish enthusiasm for the verse of 40k, the lore of 40k, because it quite simply is perhaps one of the most fascinating fictional verses that exists, and I think that speaks volumes for itself. So now we come to the painting and the modelling side of 40k, which is often referred to by those already consumed by it as generically the hobby. But this does also bleed into, of course, the tabletop side of things. Now let's deal just first with the minis and painting though, because I often see people wanting to start out with painting minis, perhaps just for fun to try and see how they feel about it, more than necessarily say, I want to start an immediate full army project. So with that in mind, what are the basics you need to just get to know if this is the right feel for you, especially if you've never painted much of anything in your life, let alone a three-dimensional scale model. Now, it has been a plan of mine to make a longer and as comprehensive a guide as possible for getting into the painting side of 40k for some time, so I will try to do that on my video roster soon in more detail, but for today I just want to give as concise an outline as possible and how I would tackle it these days if I was going to start out, knowing what I know from several decades of hobbying under my belt. So a few things to consider are obviously budget, what you hope to achieve, and also how long you want to give yourself to get there. Because one thing learning a skill like painting requires is patience and time. In terms of budget, what I'm recommending here is probably the absolute minimum. My starting out advice would be get a painting starter set from Games Workshop. These contain a few miniatures, some paints and brushes. It's a good test for you to get a feel of this side of things in 40k. Now you would imagine that these will be located under the Start Here section of the hobby website, but no, they're carefully hidden under the generic paint section for some reason, and I've linked it below. But I will note there are of course many third-party hobby sites wherever you are in the world, so maybe you can find it locally as well. Now before we go further, worth reminding that any children using sharp tools or chemicals such as superglue and liquid cement should always be supervised. If you're using solvents for extended periods of time, make sure you have adequate ventilation, and even if you're an adult and you're using obviously craft knives, just be careful. Now before you get to painting, you need to of course build the miniature. This means you will need a few basic tools. Some simple snips, these are sprue cutters. They're basically wire cutters but a little more precise. They will enable you to remove the model relatively cleanly from its sprue in its various pieces. You will then need to either have a craft knife or a mold line remover, because all the plastic kits will have these thin lines along the edges of the model. You're going to want to gently scrape this away to ensure that your miniature is as clean as possible, ready for painting. You then need to construct the miniature following the instructions that come with it, and you can use for this either superglue or liquid cement. For the liquid cement, many people use Tamiya extra thin cement as the best of these kind of brands, but again, choose whichever you want to. I also use the brand Zappa Gap for superglue. Lastly, you may want to find some very fine grit sandpaper sheets, or even better, ask your wife or girlfriend for some used nail file boards. These will be free and they'll be worn down enough that they won't scratch the model, because when you're filing details on a miniature, we want to gently remove surface imperfections and the mold line elements, not scratch the hell out of the surface. So my recommendation for this also would be Tamiya sanding sponge sheets. You can cut them to size, they have enough resistance to remove imperfections across quite difficult spots and rounded pieces as well. Now Games Workshop obviously has a vast array of miniatures, so you can either just choose some that take your fancy, then grab a basic paint set and get started, or as I said, there are these specific starter sets which come with a few miniatures and the specific paints to paint those models. Usually they'll have a brush in there as well. But again, personal choice. If you want to pick up some other brushes from a local art store, you want to go with acrylics generally, knock yourself out. If you don't like the look of those starter sets, and if I had to pick any miniatures to begin with, personally, you might think I'd just say go for Space Marines. Well, actually, not for me. I always think that a box of Imperial Guard is a great box to start with, because Space Marines are mostly one colour, maybe with a single accent and other details, but critically they're pretty much all plate armour surfaces, whereas painting Imperial Guard soldiers gives you a range of details to learn with. They have armour plate, they have fabric, they have a weapon, they have human skin and various other small details, so you get a pretty rounded painting experience painting an Imperial Guard. They're also not massive, which really keys your eye into painting these pretty small models. On the other hand, if you don't feel like you want something which has all these different details going on, and you want something which is just a little more plain all around, try the Necrons, try Tyranids, even Death Guard. They're generally more forgiving models due to them having less finicky details for the most part. Some people might disagree there about Death Guard, but I mean, basically you can just slap on whatever and it doesn't matter. Now, back in the days of the old 40k when I started, you used to be able to get a more general set of paints packaged with a miniature to start with. These days, the new starter sets contain a specific few paints designed for the individual scheme of those miniatures, and you might think, well, that's pretty restrictive. But in actuality, it will get you into the mindset of how 40k painting works, because when you choose a selection of miniatures to paint, you will have a scheme or a recipe in mind. It's essentially paint by numbers. Buying a larger box of paints will give you more choice, but you might find yourself only using a couple of paints, or that the paints that are in that set don't particularly suit what you're wanting to do, and you're not really going to get the model to look how you want it, unless you're brave and you start mixing colours, and that's not a day one skill to really be messing around with. So when you paint miniatures at a tabletop level of quality anyway, you're going to be usually doing so in a fairly typical order, wanting to keep things just as clean as possible. Firstly, you're going to prime a base coat to allow the thinner layers to adhere to and to provide some depth and contrast on the model if you're not going too hard with layers which follow. Then you're going to be generally adding a color layer. You may then use a thin solution such as a contrast paint or a shade to fill in recesses. This will add additional depth to the miniature. Then you're going to detail specific elements of the model like its weapon, armor trim, and so on. So, all well and good. But how do you go about painting? How thin is the paint supposed to be? Well, this is difficult, and it's always been difficult to really explain this. You can try and learn from tutorials and trial and error, but it highlights some of the most important things of all when it comes to painting miniatures, which is basically practice. Use muscle memory and learn how to best control the brush. You need to load paint onto the brush without it being excessive, apply it evenly to the miniature, and you want to have control so that you can detail it accurately, and basically at the end have it looking as good as possible. Again, many tutorials out there, but I will look to do one myself at some point in time. But be in no doubt, painting, and especially in the beginning, can be a very long process, and you shouldn't be disillusioned if your first attempts do not turn out as you wanted them to be. This, though, is both constructive and important to learn. What you want to do is to try and identify aspects of the paint job that you thought were successful and others which require still more practice, because being objective is your biggest tool in progression, and you want to be able to see what you need to practice further with. You will find painters that you look at and think, wow, they are experts, but they still will regularly self-critique. They will try to understand what they're doing that could be improved upon. You will never stop learning. Squad and faction markings can be applied using decals. These are little graphics mounted on a transparent layer that are softened in water before then applying to the miniature in the key areas to denote its faction and other information. They're very easy to apply. There are many guides to this also on YouTube. You can buy additional chemicals that will help this process like microsol and microset, but I managed just fine without those for many years, but now I use them all the time. Then lastly, some people will apply what are called edge highlights to a model. This is an optional detail, but it can just bring an additional level of depth to the miniature. These are applied often using the edge of a brush just to pick up detail and add emphasis to the outline of a model. Now, there are a million guides on YouTube for how to paint miniatures. My advice is perhaps watch one or two, but then just get cracking. Because no matter how many tutorials you watch or read, the very best way to learn how to paint models is through your own trial and error. You can watch 20 tutorials in a row, but you will only learn by actually doing it as a physical process. And the mistakes you make now will yield you a ton of experience going forward. Buy some miniatures, get some paints, get a brush, and get started. Experiment too. See what happens if you load up the brush with paint too much. How thin should your paint be, like I said? Try and figure it out for yourself. See what happens when it's too thin and the paint won't properly adhere to the model evenly, or it's too thick and it obliterates detail. The best way to learn painting is to just start painting. That could sound dismissive or condescending. It's not. It's seriously the best way to learn. Just start painting. I found myself that I was able to have pretty acceptable painting skills for many years just off of my own practice, tutorials from magazines, Games Workshop showcasing the models in its books for years and years and years. Eventually, what really leveled up my painting skills was going to a painting course. Mine was with Siege Studios, but there are many others who offer painting courses. I recently attended an expert course with Little Legends Studio here in the UK, and these kind of painting courses are things you can always consider early or much later on when you have tens or even hundreds of hours painting under your belt. But I cannot emphasize enough how helpful a physical in-person painting course is versus YouTube or PDF tutorials, because of how much it levels up your skill being there in person and speaking to others. It is absolutely worth any ticket price. Now, talking about painting is just as addicting as actually doing it, and I want to avoid going too deep in here today because it's a really vast topic to expand upon. But I do plan on doing some more regular painting live streams soon, so maybe you can jump in and ask me any questions you want. Now, just before we finish this section, let me answer this inevitable question about other paint and tool options. Because yes, there are many different brands of paint that you can use beyond Games Workshop's own Citadel range. People, though, are often very terrified of where do you even begin looking and choosing some of these. In truth, the answer is, again, pretty vague. You need to just take some recommendations or have a gamble, try something you like the look of. The best place to begin, though, are the basics. Get a good black, get a good white. I recommend the Vallejo Model Color Black and their Game Color Dead White. Beyond this, try and choose colours that look like they will be an interesting adjacent variation to support your existing miniatures scheme. For example, if you're doing Ultramarine, Space Marines, try a slightly different blue, and so on. When it comes to paint, there is just so much to talk about. You can mix it, you can dilute it, you can layer it very thinly, you can boost it with inks. There is so much to learn. But ultimately what you need to focus on in the beginning is understanding the basic process. Prime, base coat, layer, detailing. All the fun, complex elements can be introduced at a later time. But again, I can't emphasize enough. Practice brush control and build your muscle memory. Learn how best to rest one hand on another or on your desk to increase balance and control. In terms of equipment, again, people can get very snippy about brands, quality of brush, value, and so on. My answer is, again, pick whatever you like the look of and try it out. It probably won't matter, especially in the beginning. And over time, you will learn instinctively to appreciate different qualities. I've included an image here of the brushes that I've been using most often lately. I have some Winsor & Newton, Raphael, Tamiya, and Rosemary & Co. They're all good, they all have different purposes. Another thing people may want to consider is the scary prospect of airbrushes. An airbrush is an amazing tool, but it is definitely something to worry about later along the line, if only for the fact that it's both expensive and you want to practice those brush skills first. But again, if you want to go all in and go for it, I'll list my current setup of tools below. I do highly recommend going down the airbrush road once you're confident in basic painting skills, but it is not a cheap outlay and only something to undertake if you're serious about considering your journey in miniature painting. With all that said, I think this is hopefully more than enough to start with on the painting side of things, because it really is a bottomless pit of knowledge. But this should not put you off, because painting miniatures is a very relaxing, very therapeutic activity. I've made videos in the past talking about how I often get messages from people who have, for example, served in the armed forces, and they find that painting miniatures is often a means by which they can focus the mind and deal with the challenges that they face. Similarly, people who are trying to come out of a very stressful work shift environment, or maybe people who suffer with depression like I have in the past, or just require an activity that brings some peace, calm, focus. It is extremely good for this, and I rarely feel more relaxed than when I'm painting miniatures. So I recommend giving it a try, even if you have a modest interest. It is well worth it. So then we come to the tabletop game, and this is an area of 40k that can either be a starting or end point for anybody getting invested in the world and the hobby of Warhammer 40,000. I think if it is a starting point, there is likely some factor at play here, such as friends' encouragement or just having studied the game through tabletop gaming channels, because to start clean into the tabletop can be a little intimidating. So what is the tabletop game of 40k? Or simply put, the tabletop of 40k sees 2 or more players form an army of miniatures. Each unit will have a set point value, and you build your force toward a cap of points. The most common standard is 2,000 points. There are some parameters for how you build a force. I'm not going to cover that today, and this is not going to be a full review of the current edition, but I will speak to some of the issues surrounding this. You find the rules for 40k in the core rulebook or the accompanying softbooks in the boxed sets. There are also data cards that allow you to quickly reference individual unit rules, but you can also find these in the codex books that detail all the rules and reference for an army. Games Workshop also has an app. It is a subscription, and that enables you to basically build your forces and have the rules there as well. Now, games play out through a turn-based system where you make various strategic moves. You have the command phase, then you move, you shoot, you charge, you fight. Each player goes through this sequence, then the opposing player makes their turn. Combat is fairly straightforward, where you will roll a dice, and you could, for example, need to score a 3 or more to hit an enemy unit with the weapon. You will use the data that is referenced on that unit data card, and this will generally tell you about a unit's strength, its weaponry that's available, what it needs to score, etc. on dice rolls. So once you've rolled to hit an enemy, then you're going to see if the weapon actually deals damage. Then the enemy has an attempt to save against that damage, and weapons will have a variety of different stats and modifiers, which mean they maybe shoot more rounds, or they're more singular focused high armor penetration weapons, or they have some individual characteristics which maybe adjust the way in which the enemy is able to save against that. Some character figures, for example, have so-called unmodified saves. This means that no matter how powerful a weapon is directed at them, they would always be able to ignore incoming damage on a roll of a 4+, say. Many units also have special rules that enable them to move faster, evade incoming fire, deploy later, or redeploy to a battlefield. Some can even reanimate after they're destroyed. There's a massive amount of detail in the way games of 40k play, and this of course is the fun. Not to mention that different factions play differently, and the units you choose to form your army will determine the style, the strength against an opposing enemy, and so on. There are objectives to score, of course, and these will earn you victory points. At the end of the game, the player with the most victory points wins, and that's basically the game of 40k. You have two armies, the game plays out over a set number of turns. Depending on how you've played, there may be different strategic objectives that you have to score, and at the end you calculate who has the most victory points. And that's it in a nutshell. So, what else is there to know? Well, not to be a downer, but 40k tabletop has been a very discussed topic in recent years. By that I mean the community has a lot of opinion on the current game, how it plays, and more importantly, how it's balanced by Games Workshop. The majority of 40k players are likely hobbyists who perhaps play a few times a month, either at home or in a local gaming venue. But these are by no means casual players. They are probably the bulk of players in the game. However, for a long time there's also been a competitive side to 40k, where players go to well-organised tournaments and play multiple games of 40k to see an eventual winner. This can be a single or a multi-day event. Now, the problem that has arisen in 40k is that very obviously the way in which a competitive game and regular players engage with 40k can be very different. Competitive players require extremely granular rule clarifications, whereas players just playing at home or at a local club are probably not hugely concerned about this. At the same time, Games Workshop feels seemingly obligated to update the rules and the factional points for the tabletop with an ever-increasing regularity, so much so that anybody not playing 40k every single weekend struggles to keep up, and it can be quite off-putting. It often makes physical media like the core rulebook and codex army books incorrect from almost day one, which is obviously frustrating and a little silly on the face of it. But does any of this matter, you say? Well, it sort of does. For somebody like me who plays 40k maybe once a month or even once every couple of months depending on what I'm up to, I can probably cope with this sort of thing by basically ensuring the friends I play with are all pretty chill enough that we're like, should we use the rule updates today? No? Excellent. And then we just crack on and have a fun game. However, there are plenty of others who, just by the fact that rule updates are released, feel pressured to use them as the new official rules. Essentially, people tend to feel like if they're not using the rules that have been put out there, they're not playing properly. There is also the unavoidable issue of points updates. Games Workshop updates the points for units in 40k more than it ever did, because this can now be done digitally through either downloadable PDFs or on its app. Now that's great if you're a competitive player and you want to get the most balanced games you can, theoretically anyway. But it's frustrating and a giant pain in the ass if you only play now and then and may have to remake your army list almost every other time you play a game. This might seem like pointless whining, but I assure you this is an issue that is regularly discussed more and more in the 40k community, and for some, it's make or break. I see people who have been playing for not just a few years, but for decades, and they are fed up with this. Now this all seems very negative, and you're probably thinking, geez, what a headache, I guess I'm going to skip that and not worry about getting an army now. Well, hold on. Because I did say I am still an avid collector and I play more and more in recent times. In fact, I just built an office where I can have a dedicated 40k table so I can play more and more often. Because despite the malaise some find themselves in, and I do strongly think that Games Workshop needs to make an effort to separate the competitive side of gaming in 40k versus everybody else, I personally still find having a game, bringing an army to the table, battling it out, extremely enjoyable. I played a good amount of games on the current 10th edition, and while far from perfect, I have enjoyed every single game. My advice overall is, before you make the leap into the tabletop, do speak to people. Do your research, go look at a local club, go into a 40k store, if possible, find friends who play, get some games with them. They probably have more than one army if they're already a serious 40k player. Find out the pros and cons for yourself. Make your choice from there. But despite all that talk about rules, there is nothing to stop you playing 40k however you want to. I often will play a game of 40k and I introduce a custom mission or a rule of my own design or from some previous edition that still works and is just really cool. Environmental factors for the battlefield you're playing on. Maybe there's a random NPC character or anything you can imagine. The sand clams, people remember that one. What if once per game, either player can call in an off-the-table artillery strike, decide the damage yourself? What if in a game featuring more vehicles, any destroyed vehicle has a higher chance of a catastrophic explosion, just to mix it up and make it interesting? The possibilities are endless, and that's the key thing to take away. People are always going to argue about rules and balance, but at the end of the day, 40k is what you make of it. You can inject and you can spice it up with your own imagination, and that will always be true. So my final thought for you today is that Warhammer 40,000 is so vast that there are innumerable ways to be lost within it. You may find yourself taken by the lore initially, or try out the painting, but who knows where it can lead. Before you know it, you'll be planning that first army. And while I tend to approach the galaxy of the Imperium with a more serious documentary approach, which I've done ever since I was a kid actually, two things can be true at the same time. And so it's very well observed that 40k is by its nature absurd to the extreme. This can be somewhat detrimental to its own narrative, because when everything is supersized and extreme, suddenly everything looks kind of the same, and then it becomes arguably less awe-inspiring. However, sometimes this can work in its favour, because 40k owns its absurdity. It treats it as seriously as anything else within the lore. Giant war machines that have entire armies running out from their feet? What's silly about that? Giant transhuman Astartes carving through enemies with chainsaw swords? Again, nothing to see here. The Imperial Guard throwing wave after wave of their own men at undead killbots? A trifle. The bizarre juxtaposition of absurdity and human horror in 40k is just something you gotta roll with. For many who are obsessed with 40k, the violent, terrifying nature of it remains a source of much dark humour, but it also opens up some pretty deep conversations about the human condition and where things can end up when taken to an exponential degree. For myself personally, it's just fun to take things in 40k very seriously, even despite the absurdity, because this is what I always have found to be enjoyable. But simultaneously, there are many memes and just pure nonsensical comedy that comes from 40k, because of just how extreme it is. You've got the classic heretic being one such example, whereby anyone who dissents from the official line of anything ever by even a sliver is declared a heretic and executed on the spot. It's a 40k meme, but it's comically not even that devoid from the reality in the Imperium. 40k reflects much of the human condition in its narratives. Many of the events, organizations, forces, and individuals end up as they are or through the results of half-truths, complex deceptions, or just pure indoctrination. Some are held up as heroes, but they're not what they appear to be, because in the galaxy of the Imperium, context can be very subjective. Take, for example, the fact that the Imperium itself has, through devout worship of the Emperor, now embedded its state religion in almost everything that it does, which is extraordinarily ironic when you consider that the Emperor of Man himself originally set out to eradicate religion from humanity entirely, not to mention the fact that this same religion now may well be empowering him to return from the living dead in some form or other, or at least enable him to communicate and exert his willpower once again in the Imperium. There is so much to explore within the galaxy of the Imperium in M41. I continue with this myself, just as I have enjoyed it for some 30 years. It is true that this is one of the very best times to come into 40k because they release more material than ever before all the time, and while finding some of that older stuff can be a challenge, as I said, I don't say this to be frivolous or dismissive, but genuinely finding the older books and the material can be something of a hobby in itself, sort of like rare book collecting, I guess. And many people are disillusioned by the state of other fictional verses these days. Rather than list them, I would just say take your pick, because 40k is one of the few that remains largely untarnished and extremely fresh and invigorating, albeit extremely dark. So I highly recommend you allow the grim darkness of the far future to enter your life. You may live to regret it, but you will undoubtedly enjoy it. Thanks for watching, as always. If you want to learn more about Warhammer 40,000, check out any of the other videos here on the channel. Please do like this video, leave a comment telling me your current plan for what interests you the most in the 40k verse, and I would also encourage you to ask any questions. If I cannot answer them directly myself, undoubtedly somebody else will. So with that, I will, as always, see you all in the next one.